One of the first conversations I was ever in with Phil, someone used the phrase sustainable agriculture, and Phil's immediate response was, sustainable isn't good enough. It has to be regenerative. We've done so much damage. We've turned so much of the planet's soil into dirt that now we have to focus on regenerating. So that's what he's going to talk about today. Thank you, Phil. And turn off your cell phones.
Well, thank you so much for coming out. I'm so excited you're all here. And I hope you'll have a lot of fun. I want to have a lot of fun. So my title is Food Future, Nature or Technology. And so we're going to go on a wide-ranging exploration of that subject and investigate the tensions between nature and technology. And I hope everybody will have some thoughts, and maybe they'll get to expose them in the question period. Okay, I'll get a bit closer. So let's get started. My first slide. So this is what started me on my adventure into agriculture. The announcement of only 60 years of farming left as soil degradation continues. And that was back in 2014. And guess what? It's 10 years later, and not a lot has changed. So I guess we've got 50 years. Some countries, it's probably more like 30. All right. So one way at looking at this soil degradation is that for every ton of food produced, we lose 7 tons of soil. That really knocks it out of the ballpark for me. Says everything we need to say, almost. So what are the primary causes of soil degradation? Well, it turns out plowing is a big one. The use of chemical-intensive farming is a big one. Current livestock management, a huge one. Deforestation, industrial and urban uses. And already 1/3 of the world's soil has been degraded. So let's have a look at how do we do agriculture today. What does conventional agriculture mean? Well, on the latest report that I could find, in Canada, organic agriculture amounts to 2.7%. So if you subtract that from 100, the rest is mainly going to be industrial agriculture, which has for many, many years been using a lot of plowing or tillage. But again, just for this talk, I updated myself, and I now discover Canada has got a really nice map out there showing who are the farmers that have converted to no-till and what fraction of the land area is being converted to no-till. And it's gone up to 61%. That's very encouraging. But we're still growing monocultures, and we're still applying ever more chemical fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides. So that's in the cropping area, the cultivating area. As far as livestock is concerned, it's again industrial in its outlook. So roughly 80% in Canada of all livestock are in feedlots, or CAFUs as they're referred to. When you look at the conditions of these livestock, it's enough to, if you ever doubted, you had some empathy with vegans, you can see why they would not want to eat animals that are so badly treated and encourage that sort of treatment. So let's just investigate that a little bit more for the moment. So what's this about? After the Second World War, if any of you will remember that far back, there were food shortages. And in particular, in North America, there was a shortage of meat. The price of the meat was very high, and people were protesting. They felt like the government should do something about this. And so it was with great rejoicing on the part of the farmers when in a New York lab, scientists found that adding antibiotics to livestock feed accelerated the animal's growth and cost less than conventional feed supplements. So then they just started pouring on the antibiotics to fatten up the animals. Well, nowadays we know, wow, that a lot of antibiotics is not a good thing. It leads to antibiotic resistance. And there's another issue that wasn't really front and center back then, and that was climate change. So it turns out that cattle breathe out a lot of methane, which is a very potent climate change gas. But we weren't thinking about that at the time. So let's for a moment think about a cow. It's got 4 stomachs, and one of those stomachs, the biggest one, is the rumen, and in that lives tons of bacteria and archaea. Now it's the archaea, which are bacteria-like but genetically different, that produces the methane. And archaea are very hardy and can survive virtually any antibiotic onslaught on the livestock's rumen microbiome. But the bacteria can't. So you start wiping out the bacteria, and that leaves more room for the archaea. So this is now a factor. We worry about that. We worry about the antibiotics. So let's have a look at some of these animals in a feedlot. So here's a typical feedlot, and you can see the animals really only have enough room to get out of the way and get to the feed trough. So they're not leading a life like a cow. They don't have any cowish instincts that they can follow. They're just penned in. And you can see them all being fed. And what are they being fed? Well, they're being fed the cheapest grains, the heavily subsidized grains, the heaviest subsidized grains, and that is particularly corn. And so the stomach, particularly the rumen, was not designed to eat grains. It was designed to ferment grasses. Now, it can digest the grains, but the grains turn the pH more acidic in the stomach of the cow. And so basically, the cow has to live its life with acid indigestion, which is not a healthy thing, and it's not a pleasant thing to imagine. Well, the one feature of the grains is that they're cheap. So if you feed the animals cheap grains, well, you can sell them for less money. But the compromise is your health. So if you're going to eat grass-fed, which is what the cow and the cattle were intended to do, then you're going to have to pay more money for that. But the take-home is that it's much healthier for you. Okay, well, let's move on here and look at another aspect of these feedlots. So the manure has to go somewhere. We'd really like it to go as cow patties onto the pasture and then have the natural cycle, which we'll look at in a moment. But instead they go into these lagoons, and immersed in the water, what happens is the bacteria, they take the carbon and the nitrogen nutrients and sulfur, and they convert them to gases. And so you have to imagine that methane is pouring out of here, nitrous oxide is pouring out here, both huge greenhouse gases. And ammonia is coming out as well, and hydrogen sulfide. So all of these nutrients that we want to go back into the soil, they're just going up into the atmosphere. So that's something that's invisible. Not everybody appreciates that. So here's what we'd really like to happen. We'd like the animal manure in the pasture to go back in the soil, where it's a great soil fertilizer. And look at this picture here. There are hundreds of dung beetles in here, and they roll up little balls and they bury that in the soil. So they're distributing this fertilizer in depth into the soil. They also stop parasites cycling. So they're very beneficial for the animals in that regard. So have a look at this picture here, and what do you see? I see a very degraded soil. It's just nothing growing there. Oh, there's a cow patty. Oh, and look what's happening around that cow patty. All that fertilizer, it's just blooming, right? So let me figure out, if I had a cow patty every yard, I'd be set. I'd have all the fertilizer I need, right? So that's one of the objectives in regenerative agriculture, is to have the cattle in sufficient density, but for a short period of time, that we can get cow patties almost everywhere, and that's going to produce grass and quickly, right? Well, dung beetles are wonderful, and they're found all over the world. I think in North America, in a healthy soil, there are about 20 different species that are routinely around. But if we use these chemical dewormers like ivermectin, which we regularly give to cows, sheep, and horses, then they do the job of getting rid of the worms, but they also negatively impact the dung beetles and the earthworms and the soil microbes. So that's something, if you get some fertilizer or get some manure from a friend, ask them when did they last, give them a dewormer. And if it's less than 6 months ago, you've got to let it sit. Some people say it's up to 3 years it's a problem. But we're using it after 6 months. It's very, very hard to wait 3 years. So this is true of many other inputs used in industrial agriculture, like neonicotinoids, which are abbreviated neonics. They are commonly used as seed treatment on soybeans, corn, and other crops to control fungi. There is solid evidence that neonics are harming our bees. And that's another big unintended consequence. And we'll look at more and more of these. So I'm going to spend now quite a bit of time talking about how we should be raising animals. A lot of these ideas were first put out, broadly speaking, by Alan Savory in a 2013 TED Talk. And he offered a way to reclaim degraded land using livestock to mimic the behavior of wild herds that co-evolved with grasslands, based on his decades of work in the field. The biggest thing that he pointed to here was how much of the Earth's surface is desertifying. It's like 2/3 of the Earth's surface is desertifying. And what does that mean? It means you have few plants doing relatively little photosynthesis, feeding very few microbes that are building soil structure that allow rain to infiltrate and be stored, and that sequester carbon. Now, if you have few plants, you're going to have little transpiration of water vapor into the atmosphere, which, as you know, when you sweat, you cool. So that actually keeps the atmosphere cool and the soil surface cool enough so that you can have plants. And not only that, but that moisture goes up into the atmosphere and forms fluffy white clouds, which reflects back some of the sunlight into space. So you have less heating. So desertification really makes climate wayward. It makes it get very much hotter. And that's as big a problem, fixing that is as big a problem as the CO2 problem. So Alan Savory is saying the way to fix that is to use animals, to mimic the way nature developed the soils to start with, in which animals played a very important role. So why are the herbivore ruminants so important? Well, it turns out that about 2/3 of the world's grasslands are only suitable for grass. Grass will grow in almost any situation as long as there are herbivores around. And many parts of this area that we're talking about is just not suitable at all for growing crops. So it's not like we can fix it by just planting trees. Just to get the trees to establish is a Herculean effort. Many attempts have been made and many failures had. But it seems like animals, herbivores in particular, can do the job. So in North America, bison became the keystone herbivore when the sea levels were low enough for animals to cross the land bridge between North America and Asia about 130,000 years ago. Their grazing over the last 10,000 years since the last ice age helped set the stage for the Great Plains and the deep fertile soil that the Europeans encountered when they arrived. And of course, they would plow up first in the east and get rid of all the carbon in the soil, and so then they would move west, plow up again, move west. And that's really how the country was developed, really, as far as the Europeans were concerned. Unfortunately, industrialized agriculture has tilled its way into the prairie grasslands, turning the soil function off and leaving acres upon acres of land degraded, saturated with pesticides and chemical fertilizers. This is technology on a grand scale. Those are like 31 combine harvesters, all working together. followed by, about 13 tractors. I don't know what they're doing. You just see the prairie. Okay, well, Alan Savory explains it is not the number of animals that leads to overgrazing and land desertification. I mean, everybody talks about, well, there's too many animals and they're causing the overgrazing. But what these animals do, if they're in a pasture, a large pasture, and they're not under great pressure because there's not huge numbers there, they pick out their favorite grass and they go and eat that. And when it's all gone, they then take, oh, okay, that's not so good, but I'll eat it now. But they're always watching out for that grass to grow again. As soon as it comes up, pop, there's a baby, it's gone. Now, if you're in a fairly arid area, you deplete the reservoir and the root system of that plant, and it just dies. And now you're starting desertification. And then it moves to the next most nutritious food, does the same. And so over time, in a season, the diversity of grasses starts to decrease. And what's left? It's the grasses that aren't very nutritious at all. By putting the cows into a pasture and let them just gently walk around and find a niche for themselves, we're actually damaging that pasture. We're damaging the soil. We're damaging the microbes. So it's not a healthy system to use. Let's look at this curve of growth for grass. You'll see that there's a baby phase. That's when the seed germinates and then we have just the young grass forming. It's starting to form root system that will support a larger growth. But the rate at which it's growing is very slow. And then we get into the teenage phase. We've got a good root system now, it shoots up. And so there's a lot of grass being grown here. And then it stops growing, and that's where we need to bring back the cattle, the herbivores. So let's look at that a little more closely. I'm just going to skip what I've said there. And so here's an image of the grass itself and the root system. And so what we want to do is, you can see that after the teenage phase, what happens is the grass now sets seed, and it takes all its nutrients out of the grass itself and puts it in the seed. And so by the time you reach this position here, the grass has got no nutrition left. Now, if you let it go to seed, then you have to wait for that baby phase again to get into the teenage phase. So the objective is to keep it always in the teenage phase, all right? As soon as it gets to the right point, you want the cows in, you want the cattle in. And then you let them eat it down, but not to the baby phase. You take them out when they've eaten down to about the 40% level. So that means it's still got a good root system. It'll jump back up again as quickly as is possible. And if you do that, you can produce much more forage from that same pasture of area, up to 4 times as much. So here's an experiment that was done quite a long time ago now by the Nobel Foundation in the States. And so here in 1988, they were only able to manage 10,000 animal unit days. So an animal unit is typically a cow-calf pair, okay? And so at that time in 1988, the most that they could manage was 10,000 animal unit days. So that could be 1 animal unit for 10,000 days, or it could be 10,000 animals for 1 day. That's the forage that was available, right? But over time, by doing this regenerative grazing, you can see that they were able to produce almost 4 times as much grass. That means that, and you can understand how that's happening. You're keeping it in the teenage range, right? That's where it's going fastest. You're not letting it go into the baby phase. You're not letting it go into the dying phase. So it turns out for perennial grasses, you can do that, but every few years, it's a good idea to let it go to seed. Just because that provides, through mutations, you get more genetic diversity. And that's a good thing to happen. But for annual grasses, there's absolutely no point of doing that. And so you can keep this going for a long time and produce more grass and more cows. So let's look now at a wild herd of wildebeest in Africa, which fortunately there's still some around. Notice how densely packed they are. And the reason for that is obvious, it's these ferocious predators. So let's move on to another picture of this same herd. So the wildebeest keep moving to avoid eating their own waste. The density of poop everywhere, dung everywhere, is so high, and no animal likes to eat its own waste. Now, it's great because it's great fertilizer, but the animals have to keep moving. So if they're keeping moving, they can't eat the grass as it starts to regrow. They can't eat the baby phase. And when the herd returns from migration, the grass is now fully grown and is ready to be eaten. So timing is key. In high herd densities, or in high density herds, the animals can't afford to be too selective about only eating their favorite type of grass, which helps to maintain grass diversity. So, as I was saying, they can't be too selective, because if they are, the cow on the left or the cow on the right is going to take the bite in front of them. Now, this is great for diversity. It maintains diversity. So you're not overgrazing any of the most nutritious, you're getting a balance. And so that will maintain the quality of that grass over a long period of time. Another interesting thing, which hasn't been known for a long time, is that biodiverse pasture systems that include wild plants that contain fumaric acid can reduce methane emissions by 70%. And it's not that uncommon in a wild pasture to find that. But if you're planting annuals and you're just very selective, you're going to plant one variety, you're not going to have that. So again, nature has ways of dealing with some of the many problems that we think are devastating. So how can humans imitate nature? Well, it turns out that an electric fence is a great idea because it emulates a predator. You don't want to get near that fence. So one of the things you can do is you can take your pasture, big pasture, which the cows are just gently ambling around in. You take all those cows and you put them into this paddock, all right? And now they behave like the wild animals. They eat everything in front of them before the next guy does. Now this is looking extremely dense here. It's looking like a feedlot, right? But if you look at the back here, you can see there's a big space back there and a few cows. What's happened is part of the fence has been opened, and the cows know they'd like to be the first into that fresh pasture, that fresh paddock. So they're concentrated at this end at this point. So here's Neil Dennis. He's the guy that owns this ranch, or at least he did. He passed away in 2018. And what he's doing right now is setting up the next paddock. It takes him 20 minutes. And nowadays you can get paddocks that have what are called a back latch. And it's basically a timer that opens up one segment, and the cows know exactly when it's going to open. And they can then move on to the next one. And you can set up all these paddocks, and then you can go away for the weekend, and the cows know what's going to happen, and they know what to do. So it's not quite as onerous as it might appear. Now, here we are. These are the cattle as they would be spread out typically in one of those paddocks when they're not about to move to the next one. Now, if you look at that, it looks like a wild herd, doesn't it? And he's been investigating, working sort of at the highest limits of animal density. He's sort of set the record, but that record is just trying to get close to the wild animals. And they behave more and more like wild animals. But he has a density here of 2,471 animal units per hectare. A little while later, I'll come back to what we were able to achieve in an Alberta experiment. But at any rate, he had his soil tested in 2011 and again in 2014. And the test showed an increase of 25.4 tons carbon per hectare, which if you work it out on an annual basis, that turns out to be 8.5 tons of carbon per hectare per year, which is extremely good. I mean, that's very high. But this is kind of what you'd expect if you're emulating nature. We would hope for that, and he seemed to get that. By the way, this is what it looks like to regeneratively graze sheep. Look at this massive herd, and this is one guy and a few spectators, and they've all got their phones out. And the dogs are doing all the work. And so you can see the grass they're moving into, nice and tall. And look what they've left. It's almost like gone through the weed eater. But it's not down to the baby grass. It's still in the teenage phase. So it can come back really quickly. I get very passionate about these things. Well, it turns out we need both plants and animals. Here's a quotation. Compost is a part of most small-scale organic farms. But like farmers of Brittany and Rudolf Steiner, who invented biodynamics, today's regenerative farmers are finding manure is the secret sauce when it comes to building soil on a large scale. Just as nature does not occur without both the plant and animal kingdoms, so too are regenerative farmers finding they must embrace both life forms. It turns out that in India has the largest cattle inventory in the world. Did you know that? In 2023, it was roughly 33% of the world's inventory. In many parts of India, cattle and buffalo, especially cows, are considered sacred and not eaten for meat. They are only used for dairy. Well, that's not quite true. Their droppings are extremely important. Right? The reverence for cows comes from their central role in agriculture and economic life, and also from religious texts that extol their virtues. So it appears you can have animals helping your agriculture immensely, but you don't have to eat them. Isn't that interesting? Any vegans like that idea? Well, now that we're on the subject of vegans, here's an opinion piece from The Guardian. If you want to save the world, veganism isn't the answer. In the vegan equation, the carbon cost of plowing is rarely considered. Since the Industrial Revolution, according to a 2017 report in the science journal Nature, up to 70% of the carbon in our cultivated soils have been lost to the atmosphere. Whenever you plow, you're emitting 21 times the amount of CO2 into the atmosphere as just an unplowed piece of soil next to it. And so plowing has been devastating to the carbon in the soil. But as we noticed in the beginning, the first slide, in Canada now we're up to 61% no-till. There's one downside to the no-till that goes on in Canada. That's mostly as a result that we can spray those fields and get rid of all the weeds with glyphosate. And I'll be talking at length about glyphosate shortly, so stay tuned. So there's a huge responsibility here for the vegan. Unless you're sourcing your vegan products, specifically from organic no-dig systems, you are actively participating in the destruction of soil biota, promoting a system that deprives other species, including small mammals, birds, and reptiles, of the conditions for life, and significantly contributing to climate change. So, I think probably no one in this room thinks it's a great idea to do industrial agriculture where there's animals or cropping. And so, I guess all this article is saying is if you're a vegan, try to be consistent. And, if you're going to be vegan, then eat organic so that you won't be doing all this damage. Organic no-dig. Well, here's a nice example of Savory's holistic planned grazing in a large area in Africa. On the right-hand side, you can see how desertified it is, and there's no livestock on that area. On the left-hand side, they're doing regenerative grazing, and you can see there's an abundance of grass there. So the Savory Global Network has training hubs globally and is a big player in expanding regenerative agriculture with animals. They've been around for 40 years doing this stuff. It really started to catch on when he gave that 2013 TED Talk, which has been viewed millions of times, right? I wanted to show you some recent peer-reviewed evidence that regenerative holistic planned grazing can sequester significant atmospheric carbon. So remember I mentioned that Dennis, the Saskatchewan farmer, he had achieved 8.5 tons of carbon per hectare per year. So the best in these studies here in 2015 achieved 8, which is pretty close. And here's some more, 3, 3.6, and as low as 0.5. So, a number around 3 is kind of in the ballpark. Now, if you take that number and you run with that, You say, well, what if we were to do this on all agricultural land on the globe? Now, it turns out 3 is a nice number because there are other experimental groups that only cultivate crops, like the Rodale Institute, for example, and they've been measuring how well can they do, and they can do 3 tons as well of carbon per hectare per year. So 3 is a nice number to work with, and if we do that, and we assume 3 carbon sequestration rate, 3 tons of carbon per hectare per year, and we multiply that by the total land area devoted to agriculture, which is roughly 5 billion hectares. That gives us 15 billion tons of carbon sequestered, which, if you convert that to carbon dioxide, the weight of carbon dioxide, you have to multiply by 3.67, and that gives you 55 billion tons of atmospheric CO2 removed every year. Well, in 2019, just before the COVID era, because during COVID, the emissions went down, world emissions went down briefly. It reached a high of 58 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. So on this basis, if we converted entirely to regenerative agriculture, we could be carbon neutral and not really pay any money for it, because we need to be for other reasons. We need to get out of industrial agriculture and get into regenerative to get rid of the deserts and to sequester carbon and to have healthy functioning soil. Okay, so many people have heard the statement that grass-fed beef, yeah, that's nice for the few, but it's not going to work. It's a niche thing. It's not going to work on the whole globe. So I want to talk about the scaling. Can we scale grass-fed beef? That's an important question. And in fact, there's a movie in 2013 called Cowspiracy. I don't know if any of you saw it, but it argued there is not enough acres available in the US to deliver 209 pounds of grass-fed beef for each American. Well, it turns out that the figure is 200 pounds, and most of that is, what have I got here at the bottom? Majority is poultry and pork. And as far as meat is concerned from beef, it's about 55 pounds a year on average. But nevertheless, they worked with the 209. And they calculated, based on certain assumptions, that would require 3.7 billion acres. And that compares to only 1.9 billion acres in the lower 48 states. Well, Dr. Williams, who's both a retired academic and a farmer himself, and who has been involved in generating many of the new protocols for regenerative agriculture, and he goes globally advising farmers on how to do regenerative agriculture. He and his colleagues sat down and calculated, is that correct? That doesn't sound right. And they found that this calculation in the movie was completely bogus. And they worked out that you only need 50 million acres to replace all the cattle and all the feedlots. So it's not true that it's unscalable, is what they found out. And if you want the math, and the details are not something I could go through in a talk like this, it's all given this reference here. The economics of switching cropland to pastureland is even more exciting, as he notes that an acre of corn generates $680 gross income. Grass-finished beef can generate $3,128 of gross income per acre. So at last the farmers can make some money. They're destitute, they're bankrupt almost because of industrial ag. All right. Well, I want to tell you a little bit about the University of Alberta experiment on comparative pasture management. So just to backtrack, the other studies that I referred to, the other recent studies, they've typically involved comparing regenerative grazing with continuous grazing in neighboring farms. And they've done it for, say, 3 farm pairs and 5 farm pairs. Well, the Alberta group, they wanted to do it on a large number, so they're doing 26 farm pairs. Now that's an interesting number because now you can start to see perhaps the effect of how well you do the regenerative grazing. And they had enough numbers to investigate that. But look at the range of farms. They're located from Alberta all the way to Manitoba, totally different climate, weather conditions. So there's going to be a lot of confusing variables. So the study goal is to explore how grazing management practices influence soil organic carbon sequestration. There are many other complicating factors to do with differences in soil type, weather, sun exposure, and the slope of the land even. So what they did is they had about 100 farms apply to be part of the study, and they looked very closely to see that these complicating factors were similar in the pairs. And so they ended up with 52 farms, or 26 pairs. The conventional non-AMP farms are used as controls to elucidate the effect of variations in the AMP management practices. I'll just say a little bit more about what an AMP farm is. So AMP farms are subdivided. They subdivide the pastures into small paddocks. They use high stock densities for short grazing periods. So as soon as you've grazed down 40%, you want to keep the grass in the teenage phase, you get out of there, right? And you move to the next paddock. And allow for extended rest periods for each paddock so that it can grow back up again in that teenage phase. And then you bring the animals back. Okay. The claim is that this leads to increased grass production. I think I've tried to persuade you of that. Improved water infiltration. So if you've got the biology working well, the microbes will allow you to infiltrate lots of rainwater and store it for you. Improved biodiversity. We saw how if you don't have sufficient density, they selectively eat their favorites. And improved carbon sequestration. So these are all hypotheses, these claims, that were investigated in the study. But they haven't got the carbon sequestration paper out yet. And that's where I come in. But I'll come to that. So the non-ARP farms are continuous grazing on one pasture by a single herd. It often involves set stocking rates and densities with no defined rest period or variation in the specific timing and frequency of defoliation. Although this is less labor-demanding management, you just put them in there for the season and leave it to them. It can lead to patchy grazing patterns and overgrazing of preferred species. Overgrazing can lead to far-reaching impacts like reduced plant diversity and productivity, degraded soil health, compaction, poor water infiltration, and reduced overall biodiversity. I decided I think I have something to offer this project. So I got hold of some of their data because one of the students published his thesis, and I said, well, let me see what I can do with this. And I got some very interesting results. And so I sent that to them and said, look, I think I have a peculiar background in Bayesian analysis, which might be very helpful for you guys. And they said, oh, really? This looks interesting. Yeah, you're a member. So I won't go into Bayesian probability theory, but there's another slide here. If you get a copy of the slides afterwards, you can read all about it. Anyway, what we're doing, or what they have done, I put we in here too liberally, is they drill down to the soil and put 15 core samples down. They went down almost a meter. And so they're going through all of these soil horizons. So the O horizon is basically, it's not true soil, it's decaying surface litter in various stages of decomposition. And it's not until you get to the A horizon that you're into the sand, silt, and clay and the organic material that leaches down there. And that's the area that they sampled, the A horizon down into the B horizon. The very best soil is the A horizon. To participate in the study, a farm must have been practicing AMP, or non-AMP, which would be continuous, for a minimum of 10 years. Okay? Most ranchers had a history of cultivating crops prior to converting to livestock grazing, with a typical time since cultivation of 19 years. Okay? So, if you like, we'd expect to measure the integrated soil carbon for as long as they've been doing that grazing. And on average, some have been doing it for 19 years. So that's kind of the number that I would use. All right, so here's my best model fit to their data. And it's a straight line fit with a slope, right? And so the best fit is, you see that solid red and black line? That's the best fit, okay? And the data are all these black spots. You see there, higgly-piggly, there's a lot of variability. And that's sort of the uncertainty that's inherent in these types of measurements. And no matter how well you do them, there's inherent uncertainty. And so the job of the analyst here is to try and see what is the trend there. And is there a significant trend? And so the way we decide whether it's significant is two ways. One is we draw these dashed lines. So that red dashed line above and below, that says that that systematic trend is 95% certain probable that it lies between those two red lines. And the black lines is 68% probable that it lies between those. So it's pretty clear it's not flat. It's nicely ruled out. And the other way we know it is in a Bayesian calculation, we can calculate the odds ratio. That allows a quantified version of Occam's razor, which I won't go into in detail, but basically that's a beautiful thing. And so we can calculate what is the probability of this current model to the probability of a simple constant model. So it's just flat. And the odds ratio is 77 to 1. So we're pretty convinced it's not the constant model, and we think we've got good evidence that we've got something real here. It's a real trend. All right. So what if we take that earlier slide and we now put our preliminary results in there? How does it look? So it comes in at 2.1 plus or minus 0.6 tons of carbon per hectare per year. So we're in the range. We're above the half. We're a little bit below 3. But keep in mind, we're studying something slightly different. We're trying to detect the effect of the degree to which we do that practice. How does it benefit us? Well, we could do it a lot more if we had the farm pairs to do it. And maybe this will excite the Alberta people to acquiring those other farms so we can do more core samples. And maybe this thing will bump up to a much higher value. But at the moment, it's exciting. Okay, so let's focus on one of the savory hubs for a moment. White Oak Pastures, which is a 152-year family farm of 3,200 acres in Georgia. And the owner is Will Harris. They do beef, lamb, goat, poultry, meat, leather, and they do also on-site processing of their meat, plus agroforestry. So they have trees with nuts. They grow nut trees. Before transitioning to regenerative agriculture, it was a conventional run commodity cattle farm that used all the industrial tools available: pesticides, chemical fertilizers, hormones, antibiotics, the works. The farm went from 3 employees with medium wages to over 165 employees today, with wages twice the county average, and almost quadrupled the land under management. They now are so productive. They want more and more land, and so they rent land, and very degraded land, and they transform it. So it's an amazing operation. Now, General Mills, one of White Oak Pastures' customers, became concerned about criticisms of the carbon footprint against regenerative land management by a competitor, Impossible Meats, and the maker of ultra-processed plant-based Impossible Burgers. So General Mills funded an $80,000 life cycle cradle-to-grave assessment of the carbon footprint of holistic planned cattle grazing on White Oak Pasture. They hired the environmental engineering company Qantas, the same one used by Impossible Meats. So what did they find? So it's all in this purple box here. So you'll see a gray line, and then you'll see bars, black bars going up and down. So above that gray line are all the greenhouse gas emissions. So the biggest one at plus 29 is the methane from the cows. The next one, plus 5, is the methane and nitrous oxide from the animal manure. Not all of it gets in the ground. Some of it still goes up. And then there's things like plus 1 for other farm activities and 0.2 for slaughter and transport. Then below the line, the biggest one is soil carbon sequestration. It turned out to be minus 35. and then there's another minus for plant carbon. And when you add all the pluses and minuses up, what you get is minus 3.5. That's minus 3.5, and the units of that are in kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of beef. So this means that during the life cycle of these cows, the net greenhouse gas emissions is negative. You're pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. So this is really interesting. The other thing that Qantas provided with was a comparison of the greenhouse gas emissions of conventional beef. You can see that's this big tall one at 33. Conventional pork, conventional chicken, then here's Beyond Burger and Impossible Burger, and here's soybeans, and here's white oat pasture at minus 3.5. So it's not the cow, it's the how. So if you like Impossible Burgers and you want to be carbon neutral, you get your Impossible Burger and you make sure you have an equal number of white oat pasture burgers, and you're neutral. The fake meat industry poses tremendous risks to global health, as ultra-processed food has been robustly linked to obesity, ill health, and early death. Impossible plant-based meats products are manufactured with GMO yeast-derived soy lignoglobulin, a controversial ingredient that makes the fake meat look as if it's bleeding, like undercooked real meat, and may not even be safe to eat, based on tests with rats. And you can read about those tests. All of these underlines are hyperlinks, so when you get a PDF version of that, you can click on any of those. Fake meat also threatens global food security through increasing patenting of food. There's a strong narrative out there. Strong narratives have been created to demonize the eating of meat. Once living animals are eliminated and replaced with patent plant-derived and cell-based lab-grown alternatives, private companies will effectively control the entire food supply, and they will be the ones profiting from it rather than farmers. Patented meat alternatives are another effort to control the food supply and everyone that needs to eat. Well, I don't have enough time to go into lab-grown meat, but it's even worse in terms of its carbon footprint. It's like 4 to 25 times worse than eating reared meat. Regenerative agriculture recognizes the value of biodiversity, not only in crops, but all other creatures that evolved on Earth, from microbes to whales, that participate in the complex web of life, much of which is beyond our current understanding. We have learned that grazing animals to mimic nature is actually a key activity required for the optimal sequestration of carbon from the atmosphere into our rangelands and pasture lands. And that's just the icing on the cake. There's so many other co-benefits. In contrast, GMO crop production is associated with the heavy use of toxic pesticides and herbicides that are poisoning our food and the environment and are likely cause of the exponential rise in chronic disease. They're the likely cause of resistant superweeds and superpests, and uncontrollable cross-contamination. So if you're an organic farmer and you're next door to one of these things, the pollen will blow in, and all of a sudden you'll be cross-contaminated with that. And you won't be able to keep your certification as an organic farmer anymore. Turns out that already 95% of the farm revenue flows to the input providers. And it's bankrupting the farmers in rural communities. Oh, I was going to show something else, but I'll get to it later. So I want to tell you about GMO Watch if you haven't come across them. It's an independent organization founded in 1998, so they've been going quite a long time now, that seeks to counter the enormous corporate political power and propaganda of the GMO industry and its supporters. And you can download for free their report, which is an accumulation of things they've picked up since, I think that was published in 2019. They have another publication. I think you have to pay for that. They think of it as a donation. So in this report, they review the myths and facts about GMOs. And I'll just look at a few of them here. Myth: we need GMO crops to feed the world's growing population. Fact: there is no global or regional shortage of food. We can produce enough to feed 14 billion people. People are hungry because of poverty and don't have access to land to grow their own food. No alternative GM if we are to increase food production. Fact: low input farming can provide food security for future generations. Agroecology has produced dramatic increases in yield. Well, I'll skip over some of these things here. They're maybe not surprising to some of you, and they will be surprising to others. GMO foods are safe to eat. Some GM crops and foods have had toxic or allergenic effects on laboratory and farm animals. Myth: extensive animal research shows GMO crops are safe. Fact: the flaws in this research make its conclusions unreliable. Myth: GMO crops reduce pesticide use. Fact: GMO crops increase pesticide use. Here you can see the increase, which has been 15-fold since 1996 when GMO crops were introduced. And you can see the increases for growing maize and soy and other crops. So there's just been ramping up. And then myth: glyphosate herbicides are safe. Fact: a large body of evidence shows that glyphosate herbicides are not safe. I want to share with you a quote that I used in my book, which I got from Professor Bruce Lanphier, who some of you will know. He and his wife reside on the island. And he's a Simon Fraser University Health Science professor that provides historical perspective on the safety of many chemical pesticides. His research helps to quantify and prevent diseases arising from toxic chemicals. Here's his quote: "We made so many mistakes over the past century. First, we liberally sprayed our orchards and farms with lead arsenate until it was found to be toxic. Lead arsenate is like a paint. It really sticks to the apple, it really sticks to the fruit, and so it keeps the insects and the bugs away. But of course it doesn't come off easily either. Next, we doused with DDT until it was found to be dangerous. Then we sprayed our farms and gardens with organophosphate pesticides. Whoops, they're poisonous. Today, widespread application of pyrethroids, neonics, and glyphosate are growing even as new evidence shows they are toxic too. All the patented pesticides and GMO seeds are shifting nearly all of the agricultural revenue to the input providers. This is the graph I wanted to show you. And you can see the upper curve is the gross farm revenue, and the lower curve is the net farm income. That's the part the farmer gets. And the blue area is all the input providers. And you can see it's even gone negative as far as the farmer is concerned. But in the last 35 years, 97% of the revenue has gone to the input providers. So do we want to give them more patents so that they eliminate all the animals and we can only choose what they want to provide at the price they want? Okay, so here's another news clip about Professor Bruce Lanphier. Resigned recently from a committee advising Canada's pesticide regulator over the agency's lack of transparency. This is August 2nd, 2023. His committee was refused access to key health and safety data that the committee needed to evaluate the effectiveness of Canada's pesticide rules. While watching pesticide industry representatives shape regulations, his patience had worn thin. Well, this reminded me when I was writing my book. I got a hold of a 2001 Royal Society of Canada report commissioned by the Canadian government. This report attacked excessive government secrecy about biotech safety and the cozy relationship between government regulators and the biotech industry. Federal regulators barred even the Royal Society scientists who were on this panel from seeing evidence that safety tests had actually been done on genetic foods. They weren't even allowed to see that they had been done. They were just told they'd been done. But they're not allowed to look at them. So, I don't know what conclusions you draw from that, but I have plenty. So let's turn to glyphosate. It's the most heavily used pesticide in the world. A herbicide capable of killing almost all life on Earth. It's in the water, the soil, the air, no escaping it. Very persistent in the environment despite advertising to the contrary. In 1996, New York sued Monsanto over claim its herbicide, including Roundup, were safer than table salt and practically non-toxic, environmentally friendly and biodegradable. They lost that case and they paid a small fine, $50,000. Then in France, in 2001, they went after Monsanto for the same things exactly. The false claim that it was biodegradable and that left the soil clean. And in 2009, that went back and forth through the courts. But finally, in 2009, France's Supreme Court ruled against Monsanto in support of the two lower court rulings. Then finally, in 2015, glyphosate was declared a probable carcinogen by the World Health Organization. And this was important because this satisfied the US Daubert standard for a scientific evidence that can be presented to a jury. Prior to that, a lot of cases were taken to the courts, but they didn't get anywhere because they didn't satisfy the Daubert criteria, and so the scientific evidence couldn't be presented to the juries. But as soon as this happened, bang, we have all these lawsuits. And look at them, 78 million, 80 million, 2 billion, 11 billion. There's very little doubt as far as the court was concerned, what was going on here. And then the state of New York in 2019 imposed a ban on all glyphosate use on state property. Now that doesn't mean on private property, but on state property. All the same, it was a real blow to the industry, but they made such huge profits. This is business as usual. At any rate, it was encouraging to see that for me. Well, in 2002, a very important paper was published showing that as infectious disease were falling, and we like to think that's because of vaccines and antibiotics and whatnot, there was a corresponding rise in chronic disease. Crohn's disease, multiple sclerosis, type 1 diabetes, asthma. But today, this has continued, and we now identify 32 different chronic diseases that are sort of out of control. They're just growing and growing every year. And they include asthma, allergies, autism, ADHD, diabetes, obesity, major depression, cancer, infertility, MS. I could go on. That's only about 10, right? Maybe you know people that have these. Very likely. Well, in 2015, we had Dr. Martin Blazier's book on how the overuse of antibiotics is destroying beneficial microbes in our gut and fueling our modern plagues. The largest use of antibiotics occurs in agriculture. And you may think it was what I alluded to before. We feed them to the cattle, so they'll fatten up. But that's only about twice as much as we use in human health. By far the largest is glyphosate. Not many people know it, but glyphosate is a broad spectrum antibiotic. We use 37 times more glyphosate in growing crops than all the antibiotics in medicine.
We can detect it in basically all of our food staples.
Well, back in 2000, we didn't know about our gut microbiome. We didn't know that our health is dependent on 3 pounds of microbes living in our gut. That these microbes outnumber the cells in our body by 10 times. We depend on these microbes to help digest our food, produce certain vitamins, make neurotransmitters for our brain, and regulate our immune system. Now we know. Why are the antibiotics like glyphosate destroying them and us? Well, here's some good news. Canada's largest agro-business bans pre-harvest glyphosate spraying from oat supply chain. And oats have been one of the worst culprits in terms of levels of glyphosate that are present. And so many companies now, large corporations like General Mills, and now Canada's largest, Richardson International, they have said, we're not going to accept anything from your farm unless you prove to us from an independent testing that there's no glyphosate levels in it, no residue. And so glyphosate residue-free certification is now happening. And hopefully that will push the situation more and more to regenerative. And regenerative is scalable. Modern technology has substantially elevated the material wealth of most people in the developed nations, but at the expense of healthy ecosystems that provide the goods and services upon which human survival ultimately depends. So here I'm coming to my conclusions. You'll be happy. We have no real choice. If we want safe, healthy food and a healthy environment to raise our children in, we need to A, support our farmers to move to organic regenerative agriculture with educational support and bridge financing. It will be difficult for many farmers to contemplate a life without glyphosate because no-till systems are totally dependent upon herbicide burn downs. They definitely need to rapidly prepare for the inevitable withdrawal of these chemicals. And you have to also remember that GMO crops typically involve 3 sprays of glyphosate during the growing season. So they're tightly coupled. If you get rid of glyphosate, you can't really have GMO crops. Well, you can engineer them, so they'll be protected by some other pesticide, which is even more powerful if we can find them. And they have started in that direction. B, recognize that animals are an essential component of organic regenerative agriculture. C, recognize and eliminate corporate capture of regulators and other public agencies that maintain the existing unsustainable industrial approach to agriculture. That's a key thing. That's happened way more than we think. D, ensure independent institutions are researching all health and environmental issues that could be unintended consequences of our technology. Ultra-processed foods, pesticides, GMOs, cell phone radiation, AI. Great incentive not to research these. We need to turn that around. We need that to be done. Respect nature's 4.5 billion year research and development program. And so my final slide is the same slide I gave for my last talk, basically, except for the last 2 lines here. Plants, animals, and soil microbes play a big role in these solutions. We need the animals, but you don't have to eat them.
I was just going to invite people to raise your questions, and Phil, hopefully you'll have answers for people, but feel free to talk,
Maybe somebody else will have the answer.
That's right. And thank you very much, Phil.
Okay.
Do you want to handle the Q&A?
All right, sure. Is there a question at large here?
Or a comment?
Yes, okay, or comment?
Yeah, you mentioned 58 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent being generated per year, and sequestering 55 billion. Is that 55 billion per year?
Yeah.
Or is that a one-time event?
As long as we keep doing regenerative agriculture.
And the soil will keep accepting it at 55 billion
Well,
year after year?
It may taper off after a certain period of time, but it will hopefully give us a buffer zone of time that we can change the way we're putting the gas out.
58 has to come down, let's face it.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I'm not suggesting that we don't worry about that.
It sort of came across that it might be working. I think
Okay, okay. I think in previous years, I think I had a circle here saying, in parallel, we have to, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Right. Yeah.
Earlier on, you talked about how mimicking, well, for a lot of it, you talked about using livestock and cattle to mimic the movements of like what the creatures that were originally grazers on, or the land that we're using for livestock.
Right.
Did you see or have you thought of anything on like the idea of also working on bringing back, like say bison and across Canada, so that things that have already, like, not using cattle to replace it, but helping to bring back what was originally the herbivores and keystone species in those areas?
So there are actually a number of private investors that are trying to achieve that by buying up large parcels of land and putting buffalo on them. And in fact, one of the largest buffalo herds, which was run by an organization for years and years, they finally did, I guess they got old enough, they wanted to pass it on. And so they gave the whole herd to the Savory Institute. And now the Savory Institute manages this big buffalo herd. But yes, that is going on privately, but there has been no sort of national recognition. You need to make a giant, prairie ranch land that has got bison and allow the wild animals to come in, the predators, and we'll do a giant experiment. I don't know, Hassan, are you aware of anything like that? No. So most of the emphasis has been to try and emulate that, mimic it with either herds, and you saw the sheep herding, for example. So you can be quite effective at that, and especially if you've got dogs. I gather it's quite a nice lifestyle. These cattle with the big horns, it's kind of a different game, right? You've got to be courageous, I think, for a start. Charles.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated your treatment of the soil degradation crisis, the GMO issue, the pesticides and the microbiotics, the glycosides, and the gut, microbiomes. And I'm really happy to hear that there's some evidence that grass-fed beef can be carbon neutral. I know the preponderance of data has so far has been the opposite, that grass-fed beef has actually produces higher greenhouse gases than industrialized meat. Grass-fed is obviously so much better, reducing animal cruelty, as you've said, and so on. So I'm really happy to hear these studies. One issue I do want to take issue with is your characterization of so-called fake meats. I prefer to call it alternative proteins. That there's really no evidence that that's any worse than red meat and processed meat, which is a known carcinogen and well established by the World Health Organization. So, and I know there are a lot of studies underway to compare these alternative proteins to red meat, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about that in a few weeks. So I just wanted to caution, I don't think I can say for sure ultra-processed food is not good for us. I agree completely, but I don't think we should conclude from this that it's any worse than beef. The evidence is just not there for that. And then I think you and we all are, supporting biodiversity, and the fact that only 4% of all the biomass of animals is wild animals and some 60% is cattle, that I don't think anybody's arguing that we want more cattle in the world. That I think that what we want is rewilding. So I think I'm definitely going to be arguing that we want to reduce animal agriculture and have more rewilding, and I think you support that too, but I just wanted to make that point. And but anyway, I really appreciated your talk. A lot of new material. It's incredibly clear, incredibly persuasive, and I want to thank you so much. And I happily and respectfully disagree on just a couple of points, which I'll discuss in a couple of months.
How exciting!
Great fun, Charles.
Well, thank you. It's very nice. And I'll be surprised if there's disagreement on some issues. I'm don't know if I want to counter with anything at this time. Yeah. Further?
I'm just not sure if I actually missed it, but listening to Gregory speak in his TED Talk, one of the core messages that I felt that he was trying to impart was, and I really appreciate your, we need the animals, but you don't have to eat them, was the role of the herd management in actually tilling. That it's
It does. Yeah, it does disturb the soil in a certain
right.
way, yeah.
That seemed to be a really core piece
Mhm.
of what he wanted to impart, and that, you know, aside from everything that you mentioned, it's that churning of the soil that the movement of the herd creates that's a big piece of this.
Thank you for that. It also reminds me, of course, that if you ask Savory what was the most important lesson that he had to offer, it wouldn't be what you might expect, but if you listen to him, you know how he thinks that we've acquired all this power through our technology, but we just don't know how to manage it. We've mismanaged it so badly. And so he's developed, he's taken the idea of holism further and developed holistic management, which is a very exciting development in my mind. And it's basically, the problem fundamentally is that what we humans do now in the way of management is we see a problem, and then we define the context in which we're going to analyze that problem as the problem itself. Nothing bigger, just that problem. So then we solve that problem. But guess what? Because there was no bigger context in which we solved the problem, there's all these unintended consequences. And so holistic management addresses that, and it says, look, we have to manage not only for economic reasons, but for social and environmental. And we have to simultaneously manage all of those. And I've worked through his thesis, I've read both of his books, and I agree with him completely. But it's really foreign thinking. It sounds like it's almost impossible to do. And it's just like, for a while I was grasping with, could we ever get, universities to teach this stuff? Could we persuade people that this is the way they need to manage their council and they need to manage their life? Until I appreciated one comment he made, and he said, well, look, this is so totally different. It's like you're playing a board game with your teenage son who brings it home, and you slightly panic because he already knows how to play the game, and you as an adult don't. And you're nervous, am I going to make myself look like a fool? But then as soon as you get the hang of that game, it becomes second nature, and you get quite proficient at it. Well, holistic management is like that. If you look at all the rules, it's like this complicated game. But then there's all these shortcuts to the rules that in practice that you can do it much easier when you actually embed yourself in the game. But I tried to stay away from that because I wanted to think about the future of food mainly. And, in an hour, going into holistic management is like a landmine going on.
Could we request that lecture, please?
I have a lecture on that topic.
I just have a question. I mean, it's wonderful that in reality of my work as a physician, dealing with social determinants of health, none of my people, no one that I look after could even anywhere come close to reaching this. So I'm just curious how this, which is wonderful, will reach the reality of what we have right now, which is many people that live well below poverty level, that cannot afford to buy meat or meat equivalents, that are living on carbohydrate-based meals, et cetera, et cetera. So it's great to have this, but it has to happen in concert with other aspects of population health. And I'm just
Good
curious,
question.
have you heard?
Yeah, I thought about that a lot. In fact, I've written about it in my book.
Okay.
So here's the situation. If you look at the economics of the situation, you ask how much money, how much profit do all these food industries make? And it's sort of like in the $600 billion, okay? So that's the incentive for them to do all the things they're doing which are making us unhealthy. But if you ask, how much is it costing? And I'm going to give you US figures here, because they're not so well documented in Canada. So if you ask them, well, how much money is being spent to fix the broken people for chronic diseases that have occurred? That works out to be it was 3.3 when I first started looking at, and it's now around $3.5 trillion. Okay? So that's a lot of money that in principle is being wasted in a sense, because if we could stop feeding, if people could change the way they ate, we would be able to save that amount of money. Now, could we then provide people with quality food? Could we really think of food as medicine, and that we adopt a totally different way of financing the growing of food? Because you've got the money available, it's just where you put it. So if we took the money out of chronic diseases and we started using it for changing the way we grow food, making sure the regulations are stiff enough that no one can readily addict us to crappy foods, right? That just won't be allowed. If you look at those numbers and you massage them, there is a solution, but it may not look at all like the way we do it now. Yes?
I just wanted to respond to your comment as well, because I think the context is, I agree with your concern, and I think the context is not even just within the realm of food or health, because we're looking at a situation where housing, for instance, costs so much, so high a percentage of people's expenses that food becomes almost a secondary thing. You've got to find the cheapest food. You've got to, find the stuff that's going to fill you up and that's going to allow a lot of people to work at 2 different jobs, to keep their family going. So it's within a very broad societal context that we have to address food. And that's why we talk about food activism, and it's not just within the realm of food. I think we have to be pressing our governments and the people who represent us to address those problems in a way that allows people to be able to afford food, that allows our farmers to be able to make a decent living. I don't know how many people in the country realize this, but our agriculture system is completely dependent on migrant labor. It could not function without seriously underpaid migrant labor. So the whole system is in crises, and we need to address it, not just by when we go to the grocery store making sure we're buying organic food, personally, but all within these wider issues. Thank you for raising
And follow up on that, just maybe we'll talk about that next time too, is the perverse subsidies. There's enormous subsidies for unhealthy food. The enormous government subsidies for dairy and meat, and no subsidies for healthy fruits and vegetables, so that poor people are obliged to have an unhealthy diet. And that's a really, that's a policy intervention that can be made, like Professor was saying. There are policy interventions that can really impact the food system, and that's one of them, which I'm definitely going to talk about in general also.
Thank you. I was just, the point I'm trying to make, all I was trying to make is it's just part of a bigger picture. And I think you're mentioning it.
Yeah, I think it sort of comes down to when you're talking about what people can eat, so much of it is just a straight economic equation. And how do we make sure that poor people actually have the money to buy the foods? No matter what foods are out there, how can you make sure that the people can get the food that they need that is hopefully healthier? You know?
How do we make sure poor people aren't poor, I think, instead of
Yeah.
part of the issue.
Well, I unfortunately happen to look at this in a way that depresses me at times. But I think we have to have that perspective to know what to do about it. And so I began my talk with the degradation of soil, industrial agriculture, degrading of soil. But it's also degrading the animals, right? It's also degrading our health. It's degradation that has to stop somewhere. But we first all have to recognize that if we are going to degrade animals to the point that they are just, they could be robots. They can't experience what it's like to be a cow or a pig or a chicken. They can only experience this horrific nightmare. Well, we're well on the way of treating humans that way. If you look closely, we are. We're blind to the degradation of humans that's going on, and I would say that this is why I think we have to resist the patenting of food, because that just basically empowers people with lots of money to rake off all the profit, then buy all the housing, buy all the land, and progressively control everything. And what's going to become of the people? Treat them no differently from the animals that we're mistreating. Right? That's where they're going to go. They'll be treated no less or no better if we don't break that system. I personally feel that I don't think there's any way we can hold on to democracy if we allow billionaires. They just have too much power to alter the political and regulation terrain to benefit them, and the rest of us are serfs. We'll become serfs. We're not even talking about billionaires except worshiping. Maybe I could become one too.
No thanks.
But there's also all these narratives we have to question. The narrative, well, I was reading some of them, these myths and facts from the GM Watch. That was just about genetically modifying food and pesticides. But where was I going with that? It was a big, yeah. So, the story that's out, most people really do think that without industrial agriculture, we're not going to feed the world. It's as simple as that. That's the narrative. We bought it. Well, it turns out that there's a really nice study that was done in South America where they looked at how much food is produced by really small farms. What is the yield on really small farms? And you compare that with the yield of larger farms and the very largest farms. It turns out the yield on the smallest farms, where the peasant farmers don't have the money to use all these fancy pesticides and GMOs and things like that, is 13 times higher per acre than the very largest corporation farms. 13 times higher. Now, the corporations say, oh, you don't yield, that's not the right parameter to look at. It's some complicated efficiency equation. And they try and snow you into thinking that really, with that equation, industrial agriculture comes out tops. But if you ask yield, which is the amount of food they're producing, it's actually the small farms that can produce 13 times as much yield. I'll show you that study sometime if you want. I didn't bring it up in this talk, but so they're doing on a large industrial farm. Typically, to pay one farmer, that farmer needs to have 300 acres in order to pay one farmer's salary. That's because they've lowered the prices of the food, and simultaneously they've captured all the profit. And who's captured all the profit? These large corporations. Who are they owned by? Billionaires. Well, I have some more points to make about that, but I don't want to go on.
But I think that I'm glad that you ended by talking about the small farmers and the productivity that's possible on small farms, because I think there's a ray of hope in that, and it was sounding pretty dire before you. It's always good to end on an up note.
You've got a question at the back, Judy.
I don't think you should be depressed at all. This is one of the most revolutionary discussions I've been to in a very long time. So I think you've got some great ideas, and it's been really inspiring in terms of the discussion. And
It's been a great discussion.
Yeah, but all the principles and things that you're talking about, and the things you've got us thinking about. So I'm not going to let you be depressed.
So that was thank you so much to Dr. Gregory. What a fantastic talk, an amazing amount of research in there. And I missed the part where you said this might be available to people.
Oh, I
you
always
said
make
clickable
my,
links
I
or
always make
something?
my slides available.
Could you make it available to us and we could
Yeah,
put it
sure.
on our website so that you could find it on the library website? Okay, that would be fantastic. So thank you so much to Dr. Gregory, and I just want to thank Elaine Cameron and the Moen Island Film for these important topics together and really inspiring these kinds of fantastic conversations and discussions amongst those of us who are interested, and spread the word. Just to let you know, the next talk is Sunday, November 17th with the fantastic Dr. Hassan Hutchinson, who will be speaking on how he worked on creating the latest Canada Food Guide. And don't worry, it's not just meat and potatoes anymore, has a much more radical health-focused turn, which I could see you jittering when we were talking about healthy foods and what people had available to. So I think there's a lot of more information, interesting information coming out there, and also about the sciences and the challenges of creating that health guide. So Sunday, November 17th, also 1:30, the next in this series. Thank you everyone so much for coming out. What a fantastic talk. Thank you.